When working on a project, it's important to understand the exact order of things, the hierarchy. In other words, what is foundationally required first before the next portion can be implemented. I adopt this mentality personally, especially when it comes to game design. If we were to try and implement a feature without having the groundwork, then nothing will work, right? Think about it like a house. First you lay the foundation, then the woodwork, framing, support, and so on and so on. If you try to add windows without even having a wall, what's the point? I bring this up since it's how I've been approaching this project of mine, and I personally recommend it. Here, I'll explain how I worked it out in my case. First, of course, you've got to add the basic level, the world. This includes the floor, a few tiles for the terrain, and in my case, a quick background to get a good idea of how everything will look. In most game design pipelines, this is pretty close to whiteboxing, but mine was simpler since this is a 2D game. And of course, you need the player since otherwise there's nothing to control. Once that was done, I implemented the basic health system, adding and removing health, taking damage, game over, the works. Even the UI aspect of the health as well, since we have to see our health in real time, right? I'm not going over all the steps of my hierarchy, since that could honestly be a separate video if I so wished it to be, but my point I'm getting at is, it's important to lay the groundwork first. If I wanted a hope at implementing combat, I needed to have a health system in place first, along with something to hit and be hit by, an enemy. Designing basic combat was fine at first. All I had to do was figure out the logistics of the sword and the spawning and the hitbox for it at the right time. It was when I got to actually creating these enemies that things began to get complicated. At first, all my enemies were stationary entities with not a soul in them. It was easy. They were just plain old training dummies. They could take damage, do damage, and die. Simple, right? Now, how do we get them to move, to detect, to follow? That, my friend, is where AI comes in. AI, artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it. This is what makes almost everything that's not you, the player, go round. Patrol paths, aggros, attacks, defenses, more and more and more and more and more. It gives things a brain to go off. So far in the game, there's only two main enemies. If I add more down the line is up for debate, but for this enemy, let's call it a rotten. Now this rotten has a very simple behavior. Since I wanted to start with the simple first and work my way up, all they do is when you get within range, they walk towards you, that's it. Of course, making contact with them hurts you, and that took some script magic, but in terms of AI, it was actually pretty simple. The script simply tells the rotten to, when in range, move to the player's position. This is done by having a maximum and minimum distance, say 5 and 10. If the player is somewhere between 5 and 10 units away, the rotten will follow. As for having the sprite flip to face the player, we have the relative x variable. This pretty much reads the position of the player minus the position of the rotten. If this number is negative, that means the player is to the right of the rotten. In this workspace, the further to the left something is, the higher its x value. Say the rotten is at x is 3, then the player's x equals 1. The value of relative x would be negative 2. It was a head scratcher, I'll tell you that. But what about an enemy that can shoot? That's where we get to the bread and butter of this video. Our second enemy, which I've dubbed Skelly for now, while the rotten moves to the player, the Skelly remains in place and shoots at the player from afar. Now this was a big hurdle I'd encountered for quite a bit. I spent days racking my brain on the logistics of what I wanted to accomplish, especially with animations. So I figured out an almost broom-shaped flow, probably not a broom shape, more of a conglomerated mess, but it works. So the Skelly starts off in the idle position. It's chilling there with no one to bother. Once a player enters its detection range, the Skelly will wake up and activate, entering the ready state. From here, if the player is still in range, the Skelly will begin to aim its bow at the player to shoot. From here, the Skelly can change its direction to follow the player to some degree. Once the internal timer of its AI is up, it will shoot and then pause before it can restart from the ready state once more. This is so they can't just shoot you like a machine gun, because it's a bow and not an AK-74U. Still following? Good, because I almost lost myself. If you think this is bad, imagine having to figure out and plan it all out. I literally jotted it all on a whiteboard at work to figure it out. So how does the Skelly follow the player? In short, it doesn't. I merely have the illusion that it does. Remember how I talked about the relative x variable? Well, I also made a relative y. I had the script read a combination of the relative x and y values to determine which way the Skelly should be aiming. Of course, if the player is relatively the same height and close enough to the skelly, they'll shoot forward. If the player is below and close enough, they'll shoot down. If the player is above or just far away enough, they'll shoot up. Using switch cases and a lot of booleans, I got it to work. The biggest trouble came when it came to the shooting loop, aka the process of aiming, shooting, waiting, and repeating. Two main issues arose. Either the skelly would never shoot, or the skelly would never aim again after it shot the first time. I tinkered for hours upon hours upon hours, adding and removing lines of code, going in circles, going insane because I could not find the issue. No errors whatsoever, just a dead end. Turns out I was missing a single line of code. One line. This, kids, is why we have to be thorough. A single line, semicolon, capitalization, or gust of wind can ruin your code, and you may never know. From what I recall, I hadn't been resetting the shot cooldown or shot timer variable after shooting, so the skelly was eternally waiting. I almost did a flip when I accidentally figured it out. Well, in theory, because if I actually tried to do a flip, I'd break something that isn't code. Now that I have the basic AI for the two enemies, things are going smoothly. Really getting the ball rolling here. Soon enough I'll be... Oh no.